All right, let's try it again. Good morning, it's Friday. Woo! We hope you were able to get some breakfast and some coffee and ready to go. Obviously, Tiffany is back today with the knockout punches, but don't fear. We have a motivational speaker coming behind her to pick you back up. No, I'm just kidding, Tiffany. So once again, let's welcome Tiffany to the stage.
Hey, good morning. The room's a bit fuller than yesterday afternoon. I'm surprised. For those of you that were here yesterday, right, you're good to go. So, all right. So again, Tiffany Kesslar, thanks for having me back this morning. Who could not sleep because you were so excited? Right? I told y'all. I told you. Well, yeah, probably more because it's Friday and the weekend's coming. All right, so to recap, yesterday we talked about all the information in that purple book that each program received called EDGAR, the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. We did a high-level discussion on all the requirements that must be met in order to have a compliant 21st century program. And, you know, the thing that I love about this conference is it does two things. It talks a lot about, of course, performance and academic performance of our students, and it covers the fiscal side. Because as I said yesterday, that's really where we see a lot of 21st century programs fail, is actually on the fiscal side. And of course, if we can't manage the federal funds in the right way, your continuation awards, future awards will not happen. Worse off, if you get findings, you have to pay those findings back with non-federal dollars. And for a lot of CBOs and FBOs, that is not possible. It's really not possible to find non-federal funds in the amount of your grant awards, which can bankrupt a lot of organizations. So this piece is really critical to the success of your programs. And I know that there's a lot of frustration in 21st century over the amount of paperwork and why am I submitting so much documentation each year. Keep in mind, again, this is a competitive discretionary grant. And that means it is very different than the formula programs you are used to. The state can set whatever parameters they want on these awards through their competitive process. And as I mentioned yesterday, they are obligated to assure compliance and make sure that those costs are spent in an allowable way. And if we think generally about how the 21st century program is supposed to operate, right, the way that this program was initially set up decades ago was to create sustainable after-school programs, right? That the way that it typically worked is that each of your 5 years, you didn't receive the same amount of funding. The funding historically tapered off. So in year one, you would get 100% of your grant. In year two, you would get 80, then 60, then 40, then 20. Because it was designed to create partnerships with local school districts, with other community-based organizations, with companies in your districts, in your counties, to create long-term sustainable programs. Now here in Alabama, they support you by providing you with 100%, not making you do that match. But just know that that is always something at their discretion as they look across the state at the needs of students. And right now you have a unique opportunity with all of the stimulus funding that went out. You know, I mentioned yesterday that the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, by itself gave $1.3 trillion to schools, whether it was higher ed or school districts, let alone the CARES Act and the SRSA Act. Now is the time for you to look to partner with school districts, with other community organizations, with outside organizations to try to build and create these ongoing, sustainable, comprehensive programs. That's always been the goal of the U.S. Department of Education, clearly focusing on our students most at risk and most at need. So that is the goal. The fiscal side, though, is critical to make sure that those funds are being spent in an allowable manner. As I mentioned yesterday, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Inspector General does a report twice a year just talking about the extensive fraud, waste, and abuse. Over $1 billion each year just in education funds are wasted through fraud, waste, and abuse. So really just think about what that good could actually do. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to cover some specific 21st century fiscal issues because remember, by receiving federal funds under the 21st century program, You have to comply with the terms of your grant. You were awarded a competitive grant. If you don't meet those exact terms, there could be noncompliance. You have to meet all the requirements in EDGAR simply because you are receiving federal funds. And you have to meet all of the 21st century program requirements, which are some of the fiscal issues we are going to talk about this morning. Only a couple of things in addition to all of the EDGAR rules we spoke about yesterday. Then we are going to talk about my favorite kind of documentation to maintain, and yours, time and effort, which says anytime you're going to pay an employee, in order for that salary to be allowable with federal funds, you have to keep time and effort documentation. And this is very specific documentation that if you do not keep, makes all of your salary costs unallowable. Then we're going to generally talk documentation. I promised yesterday, and I am true to my word, I do not lie. There are two things about me. I sometimes lie to my 4-year-old. Okay, in truth, I told him I would not rip his Band-Aid off from his shots the other night, and then I ripped it off, and he was not happy. So I do lie to my children, but not to other adults. Lies that don't hurt their feelings. You know, well, that probably hurt, but whatever, I digress. And I try to be polite. Those are like my two things, okay? But I'm still not nice, as I said yesterday. Then we're going to talk about documentation, which is policies and procedures. I'm going to walk you through required policies and procedures. And if you ignored me yesterday and you plan to ignore me today, the only thing that I ask is that you take the policies and procedures section and give it to someone at your program and say, please make sure we have this. Because the mean lawyer from DC said we are going to get a finding and potentially unallowable costs if we do not have these compliant policies and procedures, because everything that I just said is totally true. Okay? Use it as your checklist. Do we have this? Do we have that? Right? I talked yesterday about conflict of interest being a red flag that most people don't have compliant. Right? And conflicts can result in unallowable expenses. And remember, any unallowable expense is paid back with non-federal funds. Why? It's because EDGAR says, our purple book friend, fines and penalties cannot be paid with federal funds. The federal government doesn't want you to pay them back with their own money for money that you misspent. Okay? Kind of makes sense when you think about it. And then, if this couldn't get more fun, we are going to take a quiz. Right? Yeah, exactly. I won't know your answers. We're just going to do like a phone participation thing, so I don't feel like I'm totally by myself up here. Okay. So let's get started. Let's first just reiterate sort of the goals of the 21st Century Program from a federal perspective. I mentioned yesterday 21st Century has and continues to be one of my favorite programs. Prior administrations always threatened to zero out 21st Century. So what happens at the federal level is we have programs like 21st Century that exist in statute. One of the ways Congress tries to get rid of programs they don't like is they simply don't appropriate funds. If you don't appropriate funds for a program, it, by definition, kind of goes away. We saw that happen about a decade ago with the Reading First program. So every now and then we have an administration that zeroes out the 21st Century Program, and every 21st Century Program administrator around the country, or a lot of them, call me and go, oh my God, our program's going to end. That never actually happens, though, right? Because Congress actually also generally believes that even if the president wants to zero out this program, Congress believes in it. They know that it is successful, and that's why we have continued to see that funded. So if in the future you see that happen, the president budgets comes out, threatens to zero out after-school programs, fear not. It is a program that across the board most appreciate the successfulness of after-school programs. And I think we see that reiterated with all the stimulus money. Clearly the focus right now is improving upon learning loss, and everyone is creating as many after-school, before-school, during, weekend holiday programs as possible. But the goal, like I said earlier, was long-term continuity of programs, making sure that the academics being taught were consistent across school districts, nonprofits, CBOs, FBOs, both in school and after school. So what we do is we talk a lot about braiding funding at the federal level, which is literally like what you see. So it's about taking your 21st century funds, maybe getting some funds from the USDA for nutrition, in order to provide snacks or food, maybe looking at other available grants, non-federal funds, donations, and we braid those fundings because we can't commingle them, right? We can't literally merge them, but we use them for a unified purpose, and that really is the goal. And in fact, your applications, right, had to in part discuss how you intended to coordinate your program with other federal, state, and local programs to make the most use of these public resources. So we do want to see that happen. And like I said, your school districts right now have more money than they have ever seen, ever. Now is the time, and a lot of them, if you're at a school district, you know, you're kind of having some trouble. It's hard actually to spend all that money. It's so interesting, as I said yesterday, you know, a lot of money isn't always our solution, right? Money helps, don't get me wrong, money's great, but we need other things. So look to your school districts about partnering on initiatives, on assisting with some of the projects that you have. That's how we expand and improve upon our programs generally. Also, supplanting. 21st century has what I call, and I've referred to as a more restrictive supplant provision than other federal programs, meaning the 21st century program cannot replace what we call supplant other federal, state, and local programs. That is more restrictive because most federal programs don't include other federal programs. So what that means is if you are at a district and you had a Title I after school program, you could not replace that with 21st century. That violates the 21st century supplant rule by replacing it with other federal funds. Okay, so you do have to be careful with that. ESSER funds, which are the stimulus dollars, are federal funds. So you have to watch that because if you do supplant or replace your other federal funds with 21st century funds, that is a violation and those expenses could be deemed unallowable. And again, really what an auditor or the state would do is look to see how you paid for these costs last year. So do be careful as you look to change how you are paying for things, that your 21st century funds are supposed to be extra, supplemental. Remember what I said, the goal was to expand upon, create new programs. That was the goal of 21st century. So what we don't want to see are organizations, even if you're a CBO or an FBO, taking your general funds and just moving those over and using your 21st century. In fact, your applications were supposed to talk about how you were going to expand upon existing programs, whether that's serving more students, extending hours, adding sites, things like that. Again, the goals from the federal perspective were expansion, consistency, and long-term sustainability. Program fees, can we charge students to attend? Now, you have to know in 21st century, the most recent guidance is from 2003. And that's where it is. We are probably not getting newer guidance in the near future. And this is where a lot of this information comes in. I believe I have it in our resources page. But what it says is you can charge a fee, but you have to charge it the same for all students, but basically make adjustments as needed to ensure all students can attend. Right? We don't want to prevent a student from attending simply because they cannot pay the fee. So yes, the fee should be the same for all students, but because you shouldn't exclude any students, we may have to make adjustments to make that more nominal. Now, let's talk a minute about program income. If the goal of the 21st century is long-term sustainability, if historically the funding was designed to step down, then it makes sense that the federal government as a whole has always encouraged program income, whereby you generate programs, bake sales, whatever it is, right, to grow the funding available for your programs. Program income continues to be encouraged, but you do have to get approval from the state because what we want to do with program income is we want to add it to our programs, and that does require approval, so we're going to talk about the why. But essentially, keep in mind, we want you to think about ways to grow your programs, but if the way you generate the funding was from 21st century funds, then that income is not general income. It's program income under the 21st century program, which means it has to go back into the 21st century program and follow all the same allowable uses. And we do look to see how these programs were funded. So unfortunately, if you bought everything to do a bit, you have a cooking class as part of your after school program, you buy all the materials, the kids bake all these awesome things, they do a wonderful bake sale, they don't get the money, right? You keep it to increase and improve upon that pre-existing program. So what do you do with the program income? The default rule is that the program income gets deducted from your total grant, but no one wants you to do that. Okay? With state approval, you add the program income onto your grant. So if you had $1 million grant and you generated $100,000 worth of program income, the state can allow you to, now your grant total essentially becomes 2.1 or 1 point, I don't know what numbers I just said. I don't know what I, whatever I just said, plus 100, right? Instead of having to deduct that from your next reimbursement. So that's why we want you to get approval from the state, because we want you to add this on. And the state, like all states, more than willing to allow program income to be added on. It's just not the default rule under EDGAR. So I do want you to think about ways for you to generate program income. Again, it only helps to increase and support the programs that you already have in place. Food. So you have to know, I get it. I was originally from New Jersey and I'm Italian. All I want to do is feed people and overfeed people and make them eat even when they're not hungry. Like, that is just my life. It is what I do. I married a non-Italian. He now has learned over the years that this is what I do. I make way too much food for all people at all times. So I get wanting to feed people. The problem is, audits over the years took such advantage over providing food with federal funds that the U.S. Department of Education essentially said no more across federal programs. And we see that in 21st century. The guidance itself is essentially saying, no, you cannot use your 21st century funds for food. Look to the USDA and their nutrition grants so that you can get funding to provide food, or look for other resources. And this is why I want to underscore the importance of partnering with companies, with organizations. I do a lot of volunteering work, and grocery stores and companies are always willing to donate water or snacks for organizations to show their ties to the community. Take advantage of that. They're big companies that make a lot of money. Let them donate things to your programs, right? That's great. It's a write-off for them. It's publicity for them. It benefits you, right? Make those really, or banana. I mean, I didn't even know how many things that stores were willing to be like, yeah, we get all of this stuff. Like, yes, take it, enjoy it. Let your kids enjoy it. Because food is just a non-starter. And when I really tell you that the audit findings were big, we saw a district with $1 million food audit on misspent food. We used to see auditors say, oh, you had a parent involvement meeting? Oh, you historically had 20 parents show up? Well, then why did you buy enough food for 60 parents? So we are going to say that that was 40 too much, and we're going to give you a finding on the amount of food you spent multiplied by 40 people extra and make you return those funds back to the federal government. Meanwhile, I'm like, oh, 20 people, you bought enough for 60? Like, that sounds right. Right? I was like, yeah, no, totally. That's not how the federal government looks at it. They want you to do all this historical analysis. And it's because of the level of advantage that we saw. I mean, we have literally seen catered, fully functional meals. And I recognize that you're like, we're not going to do that. I want to go buy fruit cups or yogurts or, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had in my career over what is a snack versus what is a meal. I still have this conversation a lot. The attorneys at my office debate. You know what the biggest food debate is of if it's a snack or a food? Pizza. Is pizza a snack or a food? What if I cut it up into little slices? Does it become a snack now? Or is it still a food? Right? I mean, this is what I do with you should know, I spend a lot of my time dealing with this. But unfortunately, it's easier in 21st century. It's not allowable. So look to those relationships, look to partnering with those groups. This is just going to be, again, one of those red flags for your auditors. And I recognize, especially with COVID, you were probably located in businesses or in school buildings that were closed, where the fountains were shut off, and you had not even access to water. Unfortunately, this is just the hard, fast rule here. Again, look to see if you can partner with groups, especially for those of you that are fully funded by 21st Century. You don't have kind of other funding to use. Look about those partnerships with other organizations, because I do go to states, not this particular state, but when I go to states, their conferences have no food, no water. You have to find a water fountain or bring your own. And it's because of the audits they've seen over the years. So this is just, you have to sort of understand, it's like the department has like PTSD over food because of the extent of abuse that was seen over the years. And then if you are a district, this is only going to apply to school districts because this is about providing access to students attending non-public schools into your 21st century program. So it is another area that we do look at. Again, this is limited to school districts because they are the ones that have the private schools within their district borders, but do keeping in mind, you don't necessarily have to create a separate program for your eligible private school students, but you do have to make the programs accessible. So if your 21st century program, for example, runs from 2:30 to 3:30 and your private schools don't get out until 4, that does not make it an accessible program for them even to participate. So do keep that in mind, that they do have an equitable share and have to be able to participate in the program. Okay, so now I would love to switch and talk a little bit about the paperwork parts. See, the cat was grumpy yesterday. Do you remember? He's happier today. All right, so as I had mentioned yesterday, time and effort is the #1 finding in audits. And it makes sense why it would be, because if you think about your budget, where do the majority of our federal funds go to? Salaries, right? So of course, when it's a finding, it's going to be a big finding. The reason why this is such a big finding, though, is because the time and effort rules we are going to talk about apply to all federal funds. So what some auditors do is they'll test your 21st century grant, find out that you're not keeping time and effort. The good auditors will then test other federal programs. The ones that maybe don't have it together will just then take out all salary costs against all federal programs. So what they'll essentially do, and this affects more districts, is they'll say, oh, you weren't keeping any time and effort, and they will determine unallowable all salary costs under all ESEA programs, all IDEA programs, all Perkins programs. They'll just across the board find that all of your salary expenses are unallowable. Again, your better auditors will check program by program to make sure it's not a systemic issue that is isolated to a particular program. But as I had mentioned earlier, one of the largest time and effort findings we saw was $134 million in a single district from a single year, but it included all of their federal programs. Now, there was a district in a nearby state that received a $254 million time and effort finding, but the U.S. Department of Education didn't sustain what we call sustain that finding because they said the auditors didn't take a large enough sample to justify the finding, right? So we do look to see how much they're testing. So this is a big deal. And again, I get the paperwork burden. Federal funds are a paperwork burden. Yes, there's this thing called the Paperwork Reduction Act. Did you know it's like 1,000 pages? I just find that to be so hilarious that the Paperwork Reduction Act is 1,000 pages. Like, shouldn't that be easier to just write up? So there we go. All right, so there you have it. So this is the rule for time and effort. This rule changed in 2014, and why is that important to know? Because time and effort is the one area that was very different among agencies. And what I talked about yesterday was that the rules were dependent on the kind of agency you were. So back before 2014, if you were an institution of higher ed, you followed one set of rules. If you were a nonprofit, you followed another set of rules. And if you were a school or local school district, you followed a different set of rules. So if you were a nonprofit, everyone had to keep a monthly record. If you were a school district, people kept either a 6-month certification or a monthly record. And if you were an institution of higher ed, it could be a 6-month cert, an annual cert, or a monthly cert. Right? So everybody had different rules. So in 2014, they combined all those rules. And equally, everyone complained about the burden of time and effort. I actually was even invited to be on a Government Accountability Office panel with OMB talking about the burden of time and effort, right? And how we can reduce that burden. No one listened to me then, no one's listening to me now, because we still have sort of a burden, all right? So what they did is they took away all the prescriptive requirements, right? They took away that it had to be monthly or 6 months or annually and who had to sign it, and they created these 6 standards that, if you look at the first one, says your documentation, right? Time and effort records have to accurately reflect the work performed. right? Let's start with that. Yesterday we talked about allocability, proving that your 21st century funds benefit the grant. How do you prove a person benefits a grant? We do that through time and effort. That's how you prove a person benefits a grant. Because let's be honest, y'all have that person in your office, they show up every day, you don't really know what they're doing, right? They're always wandering around, chit-chatting to people. You're like, I get that you're physically here, but what do you do? I always think about the movie Office Space, where they sit down each person and they're like, what do you do here, right? Time and effort is not that you showed up that day. You have attendance sheets. Attendance sheets tell me if you were there. Time and attendance tells me what you were doing. Did you actually work on the program you were supposed to work on? So the first requirement says you have internal controls. Remember we talked about those yesterday, right? Controls are ways we ensure compliance and prevent non-compliance. So what are the controls to assure that the charges you're making are, look at the terms, accurate, allowable, and properly allocated? Right? So what documentation, essentially, is what it's saying, is what documentation are you using to prove that your employees are benefiting your program? It has to be part of your official records. My next one's my favorite. Reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated. And then it goes on to say not to exceed 100%. Okay? You only have 100% of yourself to give. I recognize I'm in the state of Alabama where football rules all, but did you know that giving 110% is just a saying? You can't actually do that. So when employees fill out timesheets that they're working 150%, that's not a thing. Do you know how many people across our country had to mess this up that it made it into a federal statute? That your time cannot exceed 100%? And I get why. People thought it had to be based on a 40-hour work week. One of my favorite interviews, I go out and do what's called like mock monitoring, where I come to your entity and I pretend to be a Fed and I monitor you. And the guy's time and effort sheet had 200%. And I was like, I'm good at what I do. So I said, can you explain this form to me? Oh yeah, I knew you would love my time and effort form. So in the morning, I spend 100% of my time working on my federal program, 21st Century. And in the afternoon, I spend 100% of my time working on our nonprofit business. He was like, right? And I was like, you're so close. Right? He was so close to having I got what he was trying to tell me, right? Like, I don't mess around. I make sure I'm focusing on each program. All he had to do was put 50-50, and he got there. Right? But unfortunately, that document was non-compliant. Now, I think we can easily fix that, but you still have to defend an audit on that. All right? So 100%, I don't care if you're working an hour or like we work 800 hours a week, right? It's still 100% of your time, including all of your activities. So if you're at a CBO or an FBO or a school district and you're working on other stuff, I don't particularly care what that other stuff is. You can put other, non-federal activities, local, whatever it is. What we need to know is how much to 21st century and how much to other. Because the point of this documentation is an auditor is going to look at time and effort, look at that percentage, and make sure you are not being overcharged to the 21st century grant. If it says you're spending 50% of your time on 21st century, we make sure 50% of your salary is coming out of 21st century. Can you only charge 21st century 20%? Yeah, you can always undercharge the federal government. They love that. But could you charge the 21st century 70%? No, right? Because 20% is then going to be a finding. So that's the point of this documentation, all right? The difficulty, too, with a lot of programs is the supporting a distribution among cost objectives. But in the 21st century program, we have an admin set aside and a program cost. So you really, most of you are probably working admin, some of your staff may be programs. You have two cost objectives. Other programs like Title I, and they have many, many more. But 21st century, you have an admin set aside and a program set aside. And that's only because we look at your set aside for your admin and make sure it's not too high. Now, here's the good and bad of this. The old rules were monthly, 6 months, signed by a particular person, right? They were very prescriptive. So when the new rule came out, you can see this. It basically is like, you just have documentation showing me that everything is charged in an allowable way. So what's the problem with that? The problem is like all of us, including myself, were like, we want flexibility. Stop being so prescriptive, federal government. And the federal government was like, okay, do what you want. And we were like, do you know what we want to do? I don't know. What does that mean? Everybody was like, what does this mean? Where are our rules, right? We were so used to having really restrictive rules that when the federal government was basically like, figure out your documentation, everybody kind of freaked out and did nothing. So what ended up happening? Everyone pretty much still keeps the same old documentation. So if you're still doing a 6-month certification or a monthly certification, it's because you, like the rest of the country, is terrified of change and of auditors. We're really more terrified of auditors, to be honest. And we're afraid that if we change our documentation too much, our auditors are going to find it non-compliant. So whether you still keep what's called a semi-annual, which is a 6-month certification that your employees are working, if you still keep a monthly certification telling me your employees are working on this program, however you've decided to do that, I think that's what the state encourages still, the 6-month and the monthly. That's why you're doing it, because those older forms were deemed allowable under this new standard. Okay, and that's why you're keeping those forms. I know that they are a burden. They have been a burden. So what are the best controls? All right, your 6-month certs and your monthly certs are being signed. It can be the supervisor or the employee, whatever the state has told you to do. It can be electronic, as long as there's controls, right? As long as I don't give you my password and username, which auditors will look at. Even before this, do you guys remember the signature stamps? Do you remember those? That was also one of my favorite things when I'd monitor, is be like, oh no, the CFO signs every contract. And then you find out 5 people have the CFO's stamp. And you're like, well, is the CFO actually signing things? No, because everybody is just stamping the name on everything, right? So that's not a control, right, that you have. So we like signatures. Electronic signatures are fine, even if it's email, as long as someone can't access your account, right? If we use, please do me a favor, do not put your passwords on your computers, like sticky notes. Don't do that. And don't put it under the mouse pad. That's the second place I'm looking. Okay, and I get it, passwords have to be 675 characters and have special characters and have capital letters and small letters, and none of us can remember what that is. Just put it somewhere that literally someone can't walk by and see it, because again, your auditors look for this stuff. This is what we do. This is what we are trained to do. I'm not even an auditor, but just through my history of doing this, this is what we look for. Incorporated into your official records means it's in your policies and procedures and it's part of your practices. Again, total activity. I do love this meme. It says, I always give 110% to my job, 40% on Monday, 30% on Tuesday, 20% on Wednesday, 15% on Thursday, and 5% on Friday. You do have budget estimates, but keep in mind, your budget estimates do not meet time and effort, because time and effort is telling me what people worked on, not what you thought they were going to work on. All right, what you thought they were going to work on is in your budget. I need to know that that's actually what they did. Because as we know, life happens and the expenditures do not always equal the budget, right? When I talk to a lot of program administrators and you ask, what do you do here? A lot of times the answer is, well, I was hired to be the parent coordinator. And then they had an after-school person, but then they went out on sick leave, so I started working on that, and then I did that so well that then I started working full-time as the 21st Century Program Administrator. But then we got all this stimulus money, so I was dragged in on these like consolidation meetings, so I think I'm still doing that. But then the person showed back up, but they're not doing their job, so somehow I got stuck with that. And then I'm like, and how are you paid? They're like 100% with 21st Century, right? So it's pretty typical that usually the job that is being done doesn't match the job description, doesn't match what people thought that person was doing. And this is really about alignment, making sure our job descriptions are clear, that they remain updated. And by the way, these are all internal controls that assure compliance. Because what happens with a lot of auditors, they will pull a couple of time and effort records, and they will ask your employees, is this what you've been working on? And sometimes the answer are, no, my boss just told me to sign it. That's really fun when that happens. I'm like, oh, great, now I'm gonna be here a while. All right, so it's just really making sure that it's up to date and that your staff know why they have to sign this, and that if it's incorrect, that they need to notify you and let you know so that you can make adjustments. And the adjustment doesn't necessarily have to be paying them different. You may have to change their role back, right? Maybe you didn't realize that someone else was maybe taking advantage and letting them still do their job, right? So again, this is about oversight and control. And of course, reconciliation. Don't just collect the documentation and throw it in a drawer. You collect it and you review it to make sure no one is working differently than how they are being paid. That's the reconciliation piece. All right, then you can put it in a drawer and save it and submit it, because that's what we do with documentation. We'll talk about records in a minute. Encompassing all your activities. All right, making sure if it's 100% of your time, it is not 100% of your time in the 21st Century Program. It's 100% of your time working under your employment agreement. That is what you're keeping time for, 100% of that time. Again, I do love Modern Family. So it says success is 1% inspiration, 98% perspiration, and 2% attention to detail. This is like my life. Back to my it's an accrual world sometimes, because there's just great memes about that. Also making sure you have compliant accounting practices. We mentioned yesterday that you have to have generally accepted accounting principles. That is a type of accounting structure you must have in place. There are different accounting systems. You need to know you have to use GAAP as a recipient of federal funds, the generally accepted accounting principles. If you're using a different one, that may not be compliant. Tracking your time by cost objective. The definition of a cost objective can be very convoluted, it can be very complex, but the good news is in the 21st Century Program, you only have two. You have an admin set aside, and then you have all of your program costs. So you do have to track your admin separate from your program. And that's because admin historically, right, is tracked, it's capped. It's not capped, but we always recommend not more than 10%. From an old GAO report. And just making sure that if you're administering the program, you're tracking 21st Century admin. If you have teachers, instructors, tutors, right, their program. Even though we call you a program administrator, right, if your functions are generally administration. So if you're in compliance, what the law says is you don't have to keep any other documentation regarding your salary expenditures, but you've already had to keep all this time and effort. All right, now, what do they mean by all this other documentation? One of the things an auditor will do is say, well, how do you know that's what you worked on? If you're telling me you worked 50% of your time on the 21st century and 50% of the time on your organizational business, how do you know that that's accurate? So ideally, the answer is something like, well, each month I look at my calendar, my meetings, the emails I've had, the general workload, and estimate it's about 50%. Auditors do not question that answer. Auditors question the answer of, because that's what the paper said. Because a lot of people pre-fill it out, right? Which I get, you just have to make really clear on the form, like, please change if not accurate, right? Something that's notating, I am not telling you how you worked, you are telling me how you worked, right? Again, too many times because I was told to sign this. Do you know what this is? No, I'm just told to sign it, right? Like, not ideal. If you're not in compliance, remember, it is absolutely going to be a finding with an attached unallowable cost. That means you pay that money back to the state, who puts that money back to the Treasury, as well as the government can require what's called a PAR, the Personnel Activity Report, or that monthly reporting, and mandate it for all employees. I will tell you practically, I've never seen them do this. Instead, what you usually see is a repayment with updated policies and procedures and staff training. So you have corrective actions along with the repayment. So do me a favor, do the corrective actions before you get the finding, right? Don't get the finding then. Go back, look at your policies and procedures, make sure your staff understand that they have to maintain this documentation, maintain it, and reconcile it. Then you don't even get the finding in the first place. Again, number one finding, time and effort. If you want some guidance on time and effort, in the slides that I've sent, there is a guide called the Cost Allocation Guide. There's a section on time and effort that just talks about the importance of time and effort, some of the requirements, and it also mentions that the policies and procedures for time and effort are essential to compliance. And that's what they tell auditors, that policies and procedures around time and effort are essential to compliance, which means not having them is a finding. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So the next section I'd like to talk about is documentation generally. And I recognize the burden. I was talking with some of you before the session started. If you are sick of mailing in documentation, look as an administrative cost, a scanner. Look about scanning in documentation, sending it in batches. One of the controls we love to see, especially in discretionary programs, are regular reimbursement requests. The biggest complaints usually come from people that wait 6 months into the year at the end of the year to request reimbursement and then complain that they don't have enough money to run their program. Well, if you had been doing monthly reimbursements the whole time, you would have had ongoing reimbursements being received, and that money flow and cash flow would have been easier. And remember, not drawing down timely is considered to be a risk factor from the federal government perspective. How do they know you're not drawing down funds? Because they keep G5 as the federal accounting system. They know exactly how much money each state has drawn down from each federal program, and then the state tracks how much money each subrecipient is drawing down. And we do look to see who hasn't drawn down funds. And when the state asks me who they should be monitoring more closely, I'm going to say the subrecipients that haven't drawn down their funds. Because it just implies a lack of control, a lack of financial management, right? A lack of controls around that system, making sure you're tracking everything we talked about yesterday. Your contracts, your procurements, your invoices, that you're timely making payments and you're getting those reimbursements drawn down as well. So the documentation around this process is key. This is not me. I'm actually pretty A-type, but this is one of my business partners, one of my partners at the firm. And he is, by his own admission, totally unorganized, but he always swears to me he knows where everything is, and he can usually find it pretty quickly. You have to keep in mind that if you are monitored, all right, and I won't make you raise your hand, but if you have been part of a monitoring visit, whether it's by the feds who come to the state and pick subrecipients or by the state, what monitoring can be arbitrary. It's not always a thoughtful process, meaning in order to test your financial management, what I would probably do is come, ask for your budget, pick a random line item. I don't always pick the line items that are the highest risk. The highest risk line items, of course, are equipment, right? Or like travel expenses or things that sort of like look off. I sometimes will just pick a random line item like supplies or things that you just randomly spend money on. And I will ask to see every receipt and procurement bid quote that you needed from that line item from the year that I'm asking about. You get a 5-year grant, auditors can audit you up to 5 years. So you could be in year 5 and I could choose to audit you in year 1. And you have to be able to pull every document of a purchase from that particular year, from that particular line item, including all the procurement bids or quotes to show me that each of those costs was reasonable. And if you can't do that, do you think I move on or do you think I pick another line item? Yeah, I pick another one. And then I'm probably going to pick another one because now I have to figure out if the problems I'm seeing are systemic across your whole program or isolated to that particular line item, right? I always tell people, you want your auditors in and out. You don't want them hanging around. At the districts and the CBOs with the largest findings, they're the ones where the auditors have been there anywhere from 2 weeks to a year. Auditors will literally ask for an entire office to set up. They come every day. I've even seen them stay for over a year. Now, if you think they're staying for over a year, who thinks they're probably not going to find something? Right? The longer they're there, they're going to find something. So guess what? You want, same thing for your monitors. I love everybody at the state. You don't want them hanging out. You want them in and out, right? Like, oh, great, thanks so much for being here. Here's your paperwork. Okay, gotta go. The joke in my family is when my grandmother wanted people to leave the house, like from a dinner party, she would play a particular song on the piano, and that was like everybody's cue. It was time to go. Right? That's kind of what you want to do. Like, okay, the time has come. Everybody get out. Because the longer they stay, the more they're going to find things. So it's making sure when they ask you for that document, you can access it and access it quickly. The problem too is if you can't, you'll get the finding because you couldn't provide it when you said you would. And when you cannot find the documentation you need, you have to do this thing called recreating the record. And recreating the record is timely. You have to spend way too much time with people like me, where we have to then figure out who you contracted with, trying to get those contractors, see if they had copies of that documentation, staff that may have left or retired, seeing if they would be willing to re-sign documentation of the work that they did at the time, all to try to prevent you from having to pay back money. So it's really critical to make sure we know where this documentation is. And I will tell you a practical issue, which we'll talk a little bit more in a minute, is everybody's brains work very differently, as you know. Have you ever worked with someone and they're like, oh yeah, just click the icon on my desktop and you'll see it? And you go to their desktop and there's like 5,000 things on the desktop with 1 million folders. Even like phones, like some people have 1 million folders with 1 million things, right? You can't find that. Now, the reality is making sure we can access that. And more importantly, if the person leaves or is no longer working there, we can access it. So we're going to talk about policies and procedures first. So what's the difference between a policy and a procedure? Because the law does make this distinction. Sometimes you need policy, sometimes you need procedures. I don't want you to make this mistake. A policy essentially sets a goal, whereas a procedure is a series of actions of how we're going to meet that goal. Like yesterday I mentioned, you have to have allowability procedures. And a lot of people will say, oh yeah, we have them right here. And it's a statement that says, we will ensure all costs are allowable. I'm like, that's lovely. That's great, right? Like, that's a policy. That's not a procedure. Tell me how you are going to ensure your costs are allowable. Don't just tell me you want all costs to be allowable, which is great, which all of us should want, right? So I'm not going to go through all of these. They're in your slides, but there are a lot of required policies and a lot of required procedures, right? We talked yesterday about your conflict policies, right? Who it includes, what they would have to do if there is a conflict. Time and effort policies. The cost allocation guide talks about procedures. So you're going to see time and effort procedures again. Travel reimbursement policies. Then we see procedures, and I've given you the sites of where these rules are. So again, you know, I'm not just making this stuff up. Real property sales procedures, allowability procedures, cash management procedures. And then I have a couple recommendations around record retention, for example. There's nothing that says you have to have a record retention policy, but how do you know we have to maintain if nobody knows what they have to keep? This was actually heightened with COVID as people worked remotely. It was a really big deal of two things. Number one, making sure documentation was being maintained in some sort of a central depository, and also making sure we were protecting FERPA and student data as required under the law, especially as people worked remotely and student files were kind of going all over the place. So that point really should be underscored. Okay, so allowability documentation. Just know EDGAR tells us to maintain your documentation for 3 years, but I want you to ignore that because the last bullet says the General Education Provisions Act has a 5-year statute of limitations, which means the U.S. Department of Education can audit you for up to 5 years. So you have to maintain all of your documentation for 5 years, and that is calculated at the end of each fiscal year. So when your grant ends, if you had a grant ending in 2020, you should not be throwing away your 2020 end year documentation until 2025. They will come after organizations for prior grants. So they have the wide breadth to look at wherever. And I have to tell you, I think with ESSER, I think with the increase of after-school programming because of the stimulus funds, because of learning loss, because of all the makeup we're trying to do, after-school programs are just going to be on the chopping block generally, which means you're going to be a little bit of a focus more, I would say, for the next 5 to 7 years. Actually, maybe even more than that because ARP funds go to 2024. So again, sort of now is the time to make sure we have these controls in place. Do you have to keep the paperwork? No, you can keep it electronically. You don't actually have to keep the paper. Just make sure whatever you're scanning in is the final version. Also, please check the file. I just had this happen to a nonprofit. They took all of their documentation for the past 10 years, had it all scanned in. They destroyed the paper copies before they realized that all of the scanned copies were damaged. And they actually can't access any of the electronic versions. So learn from them and make sure someone like opens and checks to make sure this documentation actually can be opened. Because the people they hired, guess what? They didn't actually know what they were doing, but they were really cheap. You see how I linked that back to yesterday? You guys like that, right? Remember, not cheapest, about best value? Exactly. So they were like, what do we do? I'm like, cross your fingers and hope you don't get monitored. It's like literally what I said, because I was like, you can't recreate 10 years of documentation, right? Nor really should you unless you have to. So that kind of fell into the like, not the legal advice I would normally give, by the way, right? We only do with what we can, but you can keep it electronically. The other warning I would have for you is do keep in mind as you scan in documentation, it doesn't scan in as the 2018 21st century grant budget, right? It scans in as XV2RL exclamation point. So it's also about making sure you actually can figure out what this documentation is. So do make sure it's scanned in batches or some way to find it. Because I generally have that concern anyway about documentation. You have to realize my firm is very small. There's only about 11 of us total, including my admin staff. And we were so concerned that we weren't keeping our documentation organized that like one of our office managers started her own like client file folders and puts everything in there. Because think about it, some of you may keep your documentation by grant, by site, by year, by program, by project, and your auditor's gonna come in and ask you about a particular year. And now you're trying to pull all that documentation together, right? It's so difficult to do. So I generally have concerns. This is why I hate the cloud. Like I get it, but I don't get it. I feel like I'm just becoming much older than I am because I'm like, I don't get this cloud thing. Like, where is the cloud? And how do I know the cloud isn't like gonna be there? And like, I still don't get it. I know, I just really like paper still. It's so bad. I'm trying to be cool, but I'm just not. So make sure your records are kept in a way that you can find it. Make sure you're backing up your documentation. This is another big thing. We talk a lot. Cybercrime has been at like the head of the news. We've often been putting out alerts to clients, especially in education. They're like coming after education, some of these groups. The DOJ actually put out pre-COVID a warning to school districts on cyber attacks for educational institutions, making sure your documentation is being backed up. Because unfortunately, the like, well, we lost our documentation is not an excuse for the federal government. Again, they'd make you recreate it. I also really like this one. What happens if your staff retire or voluntarily leave, right? So it's retire, voluntarily leave, worse, they're not voluntarily leaving. How do you get that documentation back? Because I always tell people, right, if you are not here in 5 years, and I don't mean that in a sad way, but like as I tell people, if I got a text right now from my husband that said we won the lottery, I would literally be like, okay, Jennifer, you're up. I'm out of here. Like, you can keep my computer. Peace out. I don't even think I'd go back to my office. I think I would literally say to my partners, like, done, see ya. Because, you know, when people win the lottery, they get on TV and they're like, we're not going to let this change me. Don't show up to work. Don't tell me on a Monday, man, Mondays are the worst. Shut up. You're a millionaire now. You don't have to be here. Like, nobody wants you at work. You know, just be like, go live your life. Go buy an island somewhere. Cool. But the thing is you are still responsible at your agency for compliance. The fact that that person never came back doesn't change the fact that you need their documentation. You need the proof of what they were doing. And you know, yesterday we talked about procurement, best value, making sure your costs are reasonable. Well, I gotta tell you, you probably know right now why that was a good deal. Are you gonna remember 5 years from now? No, you're not gonna remember 5 years from now, right? So we need documentation, and I need a piece of paper that says best value, provided on time, or whatever that note is on that proposal, because then 5 years from now, I can pull that and go, oh, this is why Sally thought it was best value. Like I said yesterday, auditors won't question the decision, but without the decision, they'll question the cost. So it's making sure that documentation is really clear. And I would say the last one has now been underscored with COVID. What are you doing with documentation that's being created or maintained at home? If you are still having employees remote work or partial remote work, I do think that's one of this parts of the new normal. So making sure we have ways to not only recover that documentation, but also protect student data. I think data privacy is going to be the next wave with everyone doing a lot more remote instruction. Do we need updated policies because of COVID? Hopefully everyone's like, absolutely we would need this, right? COVID changed everything. It changed the way we operate. It changes the way that we administer our programs. Yes, even if you're sitting there and you're like, this is such a great refresher of how our policies and procedures are perfect, thank you so much. Then you at least should know that you had to make updates because of COVID. COVID absolutely required every district in the country and probably every CBO and FBO and institution of higher ed to make amendments or at least create emergency policies and procedures. Why? Because the world shut down for a couple of months. Now I have to tell you, my memory is really blurry from 2020, like most of us, right? I don't really remember a lot of it. Probably because my youngest at the time was 5 months old. My husband and I were both working from home, right? So like, I don't remember it much. It was just like survival for months and working late nights and weekends and trying to balance my kids and crazy, like all of us, right? Like we don't remember. I literally lost chunks of my life, right? Last year, you guys are like, yes, who knows what happened? The problem is auditors' memories are also very short, right? So in 2020, did you make changes to how you could purchase things? Could people just maybe go online more than before? Did you make changes to inventory because we gave out a lot of computers and hotspots to students so that they could try to remote access and we could try to start school again? Did you change the way that time and effort was being collected and maybe it was emailed for the first time and paperwork wasn't actually collected? I think that those are all allowances that auditors will give you for that time, but only if, and this is the important part, only if you have policies and procedures, even if they were created after the fact, telling me what was allowable during that time. And the U.S. Department of Education talked about this in some guidance that came out and said, you must follow your emergency policies and procedures. They said, we recognize a lot of people don't have these. Fair, right? Who really had emergency policies and procedures before, right? Like we didn't. But they said you'd have to create them for this purpose. So if you haven't done it already, what you must do is look at the last year, how you changed things because of COVID, and you need to retroactively write it down. We allowed time and effort to be emailed. We allowed staff to email us what they had been doing. We agreed to pay staff during closures for this period of time. That applied to these employees. We allowed staff to buy things if it was under X amount of dollars and we reimbursed them. We allowed staff to have things delivered and let us submit to us the code so we could add it to our inventory system. Whatever those changes were, you have to document them now because here's what is going to happen. And you have to realize I work with a lot of accounting firms. I know a lot of the auditors at other agencies, including the Department of Education, and they have all said the same thing. If you have an after-the-fact policy that tells you what you did, we will understand that. We will understand that the policy came after the actions because everybody was trying to do what they could to survive and get our programs up and running. But if you have no policies or procedures of what you did, you're going to get the finding because I have no idea if what happened was allowable. So do you guys see that distinction there? It's a really important distinction. Your auditors are not going to say, oh, it was COVID, don't worry about it. Not one of them are going to take that position. That's why I want you to know, right? Our memories are short. We don't want to give our auditors any sort of opening to give us these types of findings. So go back and rewrite what you did. Now, how did you notify staff they could do this? Even if it's an email. Save the email, put the email in the file, right, of the decisions that were made. Why did we pay our staff during closure? A lot of the answers were our governor told us to, or our superintendent told us to. Great, show me, save that, right? Remember, the documentation tells the story to auditors. You just sort of tell them your opinion. They want the documentation. So this is sort of the underscore of it. And like I said, I mentioned areas that I think would have come up. I have OMB flexibilities here. That was around paying staff during closure. That was OMB and ed flexibility. All of the COVID letters and flexibilities that came out are on my firm's website. We have like a resources page. You're welcome to just go on there and access the resources. But do know that this is required. And now why do I have the creepy zombie? Couple reasons. Number one, the global pandemic has taught us that we need to have emergency procedures. Now, you know that better than many states because of natural disasters that happen and hurricanes and other things that have happened to the states. But the reality is we need some emergency policy moving forward. I do recommend you keep it somewhat vague because we don't know what that emergency would be, right? Normally when I talk more about emergency policies and procedures, I have pictures of aliens, I have pictures of zombies, I have pictures of murder hornets, because of course, why wouldn't those also have shown up in 2020? And then by us, we had cicadas. You probably didn't have cicadas here, but then the cicadas brought these biting like gnats. It was like, it's like what? It was like, okay, how many things have happened now? Like the frogs, I was like, I feel like we're up to 5 at this point. Lamb's blood everywhere. Okay. So guess who else has an emergency policy? The Center for Disease Control has a zombie emergency policy, if you didn't know that. And I gave you the link because it's awesome. They have entire procedures on how to prepare for a zombie apocalypse. They have school posters. They have school things you can put out for your students. It's a whole thing they rolled out, and this was years ago. It actually got rolled out when The Walking Dead first became popular. And what I think is really cool is think about the person at the CDC that was tasked to write this. How much fun did that person have, right? Like they went from boring like CDC regs to creating zombie apocalypse emergency policies and procedures. And I've read them and they're actually pretty awesome because it'll be like, you know, what they did, which is super creative, was to say, okay, if there's a zombie apocalypse, make sure you know your exit routes because you're gonna need to get out really quickly because zombies eat brains and you have a brain, right? It like goes on and on, like make sure that there's a meeting space or that you have emergency food. It's really very creative. Clearly shows you how it could be used in multiple emergencies. But I'm telling you, it's cool. They have posters, they have like all kinds of cool stuff. You should just go on and look. But that's like the fun part of my real thing, which is like, in order for some of our costs to be allowable, we do have to recreate these emergency policies. And this really has shown us that we have to have some policy in the future. Even if the policy is, we will notify you of changes to these existing policies and procedures as emergencies arrive, right? Even if it's something as simple as that, right? Or who has the authority to, you know, make amendments. And there probably should be multiple people depending on, I imagine, what the emergency is, right? If your superintendent is a zombie, he can't be the only, or she can't be the only one making those decisions, right? So there you go. All right, any questions on this? Okay, so this is where we're gonna do like a little bit of a game. Please join me in this, otherwise it's gonna be, you know, me just still up here talking. You can use your phone, you can use your laptop. We're just gonna do some polling and talk about some questions. This is gonna be kind of a re-emphasis of what we spoke about yesterday. I will never know who said what. It's not gonna matter. It's just kind of to help test where we are with some of the things we have spoken about. And as you all log in, I do want to say that I recognize that this is not the most exciting topic as we've been talking about, but it is a crucial topic. And if nothing else, I hope that you recognize from me that I love my job. I love what I do. I almost became a teacher. I almost did Teach for America. It's kind of interesting. I went to law school and ended up in the education world because I do feel like if I can help make sure those T's are crossed and I's are dotted, you can perform your jobs, which are more important because you're helping students. I've learned so much more from all of you than I could ever teach you, and hopefully there's a little bit that you're getting out of all of this because it really is the critical piece. I have just seen some phenomenal programs crumble because the finance side people didn't realize that the finance side was going to be such a burden. And I don't want that to happen. All right, everybody have a minute to get on a participle? Anybody still need a minute to log in? Okay, I'll give you another minute or two. All right. Not a ton of questions, but just a couple. Hopefully this will work. All right, we ready? All right, so you just have some blue squares. So question 1, a cost is blank when it does not exceed the cost that would be incurred by a prudent person under similar circumstances. We spoke yesterday about necessary, reasonableness, allocable, or below the micro purchase threshold. So in the bottom corner, I can see how many people have answered. We're going to kind of let that go up a little bit. So is it necessary when it does not exceed the cost? Is it reasonable? Is that allocable? Or if it's below the micro purchase, then it automatically is something that would not exceed the cost. All right, that's a good number. All right, so what I have on my slides for you is the citation. You will actually get where the rule is. And this is showing reasonable. Yes, the majority got it. That's right. Necessary is for the performance or the administration of your grant. Reasonableness means the cost is of a fair market value, right? What we call that prudent person, not the crazy person jumping off a mountain, but the administrator that we love. You can be both for the record, though. You know. Okay, question 2. A federal grants administrator cannot be personally liable if they are doing what their boss tells them to do. True or false? That number jumped from 9 to 60 really quickly. Okay. This is one of those, like, I'm pretty sure everyone got this one. That's right. False. Okay, for those who wished it true, unfortunately it is not true. And I will tell you why, right? A lot of people think, well, it's the scope of my employment. I was told to do it. Scope of employment is a legal thing that happens with liability. That's not a thing with federal grants. There is a law called the False Claims Act. And we see a lot of cases brought under the False Claims Act. It brings civil and criminal penalties. So you actually can be charged criminally under the False Claims Act or under civil law. Now, the False Claims Act essentially says if you knowingly submit something that is false, right, you can have penalties brought about you. So where this can come about is if you know that someone is submitting false expenditure reports, if they are submitting false invoices and you are paying them or submitting that even to the state, that is a false claim. On the civil side, you can be charged per false claim. So every document you submit is a violation, right? And same thing on the criminal side. And on the civil side, the damages are per violation plus treble damages. So 3 times, and you don't want to get into trouble. I know. You know, I'll be here all week. I won't, but you know, okay. So why do I want you to know about the False Claims Act? Again, this is actually a true story. I was at a conference and 2 women came up to me and they were like, we need to talk to you. I was like, sure. They're like, no, not now. We're gonna meet you at 4 o'clock in that room. And I was like, I'm getting murdered. Okay. And then they like left. It was super weird. And I was like, what is going on? And I knew them, right? You know, from conferences, you recognize people. Like, what is going on? So I literally meet them in the dark room at 4 o'clock in a hotel. And they proceed to tell me that they have evidence that their boss is taking bribes, who's the CFO. Their boss is taking bribes. They have evidence of it. They're keeping that evidence at their house, that he's getting kickbacks, that a lot of stuff's happening at their district, and they don't know what to do. And they're afraid they're gonna get caught. Oh, and by the way, we're hiding in the room because he's at the conference. Right? I'm like, okay, this all makes sense now, right? So the problem is, right, now my first reaction was, we have to protect each of you individually, because if you simply submit reports to the state that you know to be false, you are subjecting yourself to the False Claims Act. So if you think this is ever an issue for you, you have to do something like these women did. Because what we did is, through me, I contacted, guess who? The state. We told them what was going on. The state came up with a different reason to visit the district. Now, why is that so important? Because now these women could continue to submit the reports to the state. Why? Because the state knew that they knew it wasn't true. They weren't submitting it for truth. They were submitting it to kind of play a game until things could happen, protecting them. And that's what happened. The state came in with a new reason all of a sudden to monitor. The OIG was informed, and they did the investigation, and no one knew who it was and the why. That's why I want you to be careful. When people say, I don't care, make it happen, right? Now, that's not like, I don't think that's the best use of our funds. That's not what I'm talking. I'm literally talking crime, right? We're talking about criminal action here, not like, I don't think this is the best use of our funds. Like, that's just a disagreement, okay? We're really talking crime here. But if you know or have reason to know, it's not just new, it's new or reason to know. That kind of blind eye doesn't work. And again, it's because of all these cases we've talked about, but it's called the False Claims Act. It is alive and well. We see it happen a lot. And like I said, that movie, Bad Education, I really don't want to give it away, but there's so many good things that, crazy things that happen. And it doesn't give away the story, but one thing you should know is the way this entire scheme came down. It shows you that there's fraud actually in this particular district, from the superintendent all the way to their single auditors. They were paying off their single auditors for clean audits. It's why nobody knew what was going on for so long. And it was actually broke, the entire story was broke by a high school news reporter, by like a student, broke the whole thing. That is actually a true part of the story. So be warned. Okay, next question. An LEA runs a competition and receives a bid from an employee's immediate family member. The employee plays no part in the procurement process, so does the LEA need to disclose the conflict? All right. A lot of yeses, some no's, and the it depends. I love the it depends. That's like lawyers' first thing you learn in law school is always answer with it depends. You know, I'll tell you, with this, I'm going to give partial credit to everybody. I know that's like such a cop-out, because I do think the it depends is right. Technically, the law would say no, because the conflict of interest provisions apply to employees involved in the procurement process. But the reason why I like the it depends answer is I think we need more information here, right? About who the employee was. Is it their supervisor, right? Who has an influence? Was there something about this? Remember, anytime we are going to hire someone's immediate family member, it's just gonna have a question. It's better to simply admit it. This is my, this is my brother, this is my whoever. I'm removing myself and document that, and now you're fine. Personally, I would never want to work with my brother, but people apparently want to work with I would never want to work with any family member, to be quite honest, but okay. The non-federal entities' policies and procedures require a full inventory of equipment and laptops every year. One school only performs an inventory 2 years, citing the uniform guidance and EDGAR requirement we spoke about yesterday. Is the school in compliance with the uniform guidance? Which is also EDGAR, remember, right? We use those interchangeably. Uniform guidance or uniform grants guidance is incorporated into EDGAR. So your policy says 1 year, EDGAR says every 2. Is this school in compliance? And if you're not sure, you can guess, because I will never know who guessed what. All right. The no's have it. Because remember, yesterday, right, what the rules say is that you have to have policies and procedures in place, and in order for any cost to be allowable, it has to be consistent with your policies and procedures. You can always be more restrictive than federal law. Okay, so what that means is if you set this for a year, you must do a year inventory, you will get a finding. If your internal policies and procedures said 3 years, guess what? You can't be less restrictive, you'd have to do 2. But if you are more restrictive, you'd have to do the 1. So the no's have this one. Well done. All right, the non-federal entity is required to give preference to goods made in America and to companies located within its state geographical borders. This is going to test those that were either have prior knowledge or were paying attention yesterday. Is this true or false? You should also know that in some states, you're so lucky in Alabama, in some states, they make their applicants take a grants test before they can be awarded funds. Did you know that? Because I have done it for those states. If they fail the test, they actually don't get their funding. Okay, I know you're like, what? Now I'm totally paying attention. Okay, so this answer is actually not true. I don't know why the true popped up. It is false. Why is this false? This didn't actually show up as who answered it. There we go. So this is false. This was a little bit tricky, okay? There was a new rule that came about in last year in the updates that said you have to give a preference to goods made in America, but the underlying rule has not changed, that you are prohibited from giving in-state or geographical preferences. So remember I said yesterday, you actually have to give preference for goods and services in the United States, but you cannot give a preference for goods or services in your state or county. Now, a lot of states have a rule that you have to give preference to those companies in your state or county, but guess what? State law doesn't trump federal law, so federal law says you can't do that with federal funds. So, yay, America, boo, states. Not really, you know what I mean. I don't really feel like that. I love all states. Okay, question 6. The non-federal entity that maintains an accurate budget complies with the financial management requirements of EDGAR. True. Yes, because the budget control is the key to grants management. No, because grants also have to compare budgeted to actuals. Or no, because the budget doesn't really matter. Please don't pick D. I had a French professor in college. I would walk around during tests and be like, no, that does not C. Just like, so don't do D. D is not the right answer. And I think I only have 15 questions. I actually just came up for a group with a 100 question grants test. So if you're ever in for some real fun. All right, so the C's have it. The budget is important, but it is not the key to your financial management system, right? That's why the answer is not going to be A, and that's why the answer is not going to be B. The budget is important, but that is not the only requirement of your financial management system, right? We spoke yesterday, there are 7 requirements you have to meet. You have to have detailed accounting records. You have to have financial reporting. You have to identify the actual financial information as required. Cash management procedures, allowability procedures, reconciliation against your expenditures. So this is just one of the many requirements. Just having your budget is not enough. Making sure you're spending in accordance with your budget gets you into compliance. Okay, you're attending an education conference in Houston. The conference is in October, and you purchase your airplane ticket in May. The airplane ticket obligates to the federal grant award on the date you decided to make your travel arrangements, on the date the travel arrangements are booked and your seat assignments are confirmed, on the date the travel arrangements are paid in full, or on the date you take the flight to Houston. Again, something we did cover yesterday. You know, some of you are like, yeah, I got this one. I was listening. You're my people. You are my people. All right. Oh, shoot, that one didn't. Well, that didn't tell me who got it right, but it's D, whoever got the Ds. I don't know why that one didn't show up. Remember, our obligation chart in EDGAR, travel obligates when travel is taken. So you cannot reimburse yourself for flights that have just been paid for. You have to wait until you take the travel to actually reimburse yourself for that expense. Otherwise, it is not a valid obligation. Okay. Let's try to get to the next one now. Okay, question 8. Which of these individuals need to keep time and effort records? A part-time employee spending 50% of her time working on Title 1A and paid out of Title 1A. A part-time contractor spending 50% of her time working on Title 1A and paid from ESSER funds. A full-time employee spending 50% of her time on accountability planning and paid from ESSER funds. A only, or it depends. ESSER funds are federal funds, so I'm actually going to give some partial credit here. Though it's weird that D would say A only, because then when you just pick A, that's how you can tell there's a typo on this question. There is a typo on this question, so we're going to give a lot of partial credits on this one. I'm like, wait a minute, that's not right. Okay, so you know what? E's are totally going to get a point because this is not, the D should have said A and C only. So the A's get it, the C's get it, the D's get it, and the E's get it. The reason why B is wrong is time and effort doesn't apply to contractors. Remember, it applies to employees paid with federal funds. Any employee, whether they're part-time or full-time, paid with federal funds has to keep time and effort records, all right? So D should have said A and C. So if you picked A, C, D, or E, you are totally getting credit for this one. Well done. It's so funny, A only. Like, well, do you just pick A? That doesn't make sense. Okay, non-federal entity contracts with a company to offer virtual instruction in its schools. The contract obligates to the federal award on the date the services begin, on the first day of the grant, on the date of the finalized contract, or on the date services are complete. So this is another obligation date. Now, if you're not familiar with the obligation date charts, your EDGAR book, I have this site here, part 76, tells us exactly when things obligate. I really try to make my slides resources for you. So I did send them to the state. If they haven't shared them, they will. They're shaking their heads yes. Use them as a resource. Use them on like, oh, I remember she said something about that. You don't have to remember what I'm saying. Just remember where the resources are when you're making the decisions. So the C's have it. When does the contract obligate? Remember, an obligation is a promise to pay. When does a contract obligate? The date that contract is finalized. When can it be reimbursed? Yeah, after services are performed and verified, right? But that is not what an obligation is. An obligation is a promise to pay. So we always look at the date of the obligation because then you have time to liquidate, i.e. perform out, finalize, pay out your awards. All right, to meet the equipment management requirements, a non-federal entity must take physical inventory every 2 years, investigate all incidents of loss, damage, or theft, maintain property records that include the description of the property, serial number, source of funds, date and cost, all of the above or none of the above because we're going to defer to the policies and procedures and discretion of the non-federal entity. Excellent. Knock that out of the park. Whoever tried E, that falls under the nice try. These are all federal requirements. Nice effort there, totally wrong. Travel paid with federal funds must be charged on a per diem basis. True or false? And the answer is The answer is actually false, but if you answered true because that's your policies and procedures, I would give you credit. Because what the federal law says is it's up to you to decide. We look at your policies and procedures. It's not mandated one way or the other. It can be per diem, it can be on actuals, it could be a combination of both. We look to your own policies and procedures to determine how federal reimbursements work for travel. If you have no policy, it defaults to federal requirements, or in your case, probably state law. All right, you receive a fruit, come on guys, this is the one from yesterday, right? You receive a fruit basket from a contractor for the holidays. You may accept it provided you already have awarded the contract. Your conflict of interest policy allows for unsolicited gifts of nominal value, and the fruit basket falls below that. The fruit basket is less than 10% of the value of the contractor's services, or none of the above. You must destroy the fruit basket immediately. So what do we think? That's right, the B's have it. The D's, I totally appreciate you wanting to destroy it. The C's, that falls under the nice try. It has nothing to do with the value of the contractor's services. The B's absolutely have it. Make sure to go back and set those gratuity thresholds. A subgrant is different than a contract because a subgrant uses federal funds to